All right, we continue. Last time we were talking about jails and thrones and dancing princesses. Actually, the dancing princesses part got me thinking this morning. I was trying to consider what are the other archetypes of the princess, and I'm wondering how they came to be. One that we often see in fairy tales is the exiled princess, the princess in the tower, that was shut away. And the question is, does that show up in more than one way besides literally the physical tower? Because obviously you have Rapunzel. But if you think about it, Aurora as well is the princess who's been shut away. She's just not in a physical tower. On the other hand, you have things like in Shrek, but that's a lampooning of these fairy tale archetypes. So it itself adheres to them quite closely. But I'm also wondering, does the exiled princess happen? It seems like that's done as an overabundance of caution, right? That it's done in a way to protect them from outside influence, whether that's just protection from harm in the case of Aurora and Sleeping Beauty, or is it protection in the way of I don't want her to be stolen away with Rapunzel? Or are those the only two that are these exiled princesses? I'm trying to think of other princess tropes. Because the dancing princess, I didn't realize how deep that is in real life, right? In real life, that happened a bunch. Look at all those scriptural ideas. I mean, even heck, if you look at the Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille with Charlton Heston, like all the Jethro's girls dance in front of Moses so he can choose which one to marry. There it is, an example there. So the idea of dancing to catch the eye of the person involved, that's a lot more real than I thought. And it just, you see it everywhere, but you don't acknowledge it until it hits that switch in your brain. So I'm trying to think of how many other times I have these overlooked tropes for princesses that it's just like, well, is that really true? Because we don't exactly hold princesses in towers anymore, but yet at the same time, how did that trope come to be with Rapunzel or Aurora or things like that? In the same way, if I go down the bend of Jordan Peterson, psychologically that's very true. There's so many times that we always just try and protect our children, overprotect our children to the point that they become either less than perfectly functional human adult, or they become less useful, or they become stagnant or traumatized when the world comes crashing into their world after we have a lapse of security against such things, whatever it is. Name it however you want. There's the kind of a Jordan Peterson bent to that, but I am very curious if there's any other true archetypes of not just fairy tale, but true archetypes of women's interaction in the world. In this case, it was princesses dancing before men to get their attention for generally nefarious things in each of the biblical stories. Which makes me wonder, if that is a nefarious one, is there a opposite idealistic or altruistic one? Like a princess sacrificing herself for the will of others or something. I don't know. That's one of those weird things that culturally we may see it all the time, but we keep overlooking it because we just think it's part of the environment. So there's my ruminations on last time. This time we have steel, glass, and silk. Before coming to grips with the grim and depressing military annals to make up the bulk of Jaredite as of all ancient history, it will be our pleasant duty to consider briefly the few casual references contained in the Book of Mormon to the material culture of this strange nation. A few years ago, your loudest objection to the Jaredite history would most certainly have been its careless references to iron and even steel. See chapter 7, verse 9 of Ether. In an age when iron and steel were supposedly undreamed of, again, he's pointing out the notion that when you apply the idea of slow evolutionary progress to civilization, that doesn't actually work. But that was the zeitgeist that put it up into this system, is that the whole idea of evolution being this very simple, slow, gradual progress of everything took hold in all sorts of different fields, much to the lessening and worsening of those different fields, whether that's social evolution, where only socially the strong should survive. See the atrocities of the 20th century for how that turned out. Also the idea of civilizations being this slow, plodding evolution, when that is obviously not the case, through times where it was up and down according to stability, or so much more. So, yeah, even physics and science, this concept of the universe slowly evolving over time is now getting challenged by the James Webb Telescope, where they look really, really far back and they see that there are structures, very big, very complex galactic structures that shouldn't be there according to the time frame that they have. Now, you can try and defend the original model and say that, well, maybe it's just that it took longer than we thought, or it's been going longer than we thought, or whatever else. But there's some real big changes that probably need to be made. See, Sabine Hoffenstettler, for her kind of take on it, she does not suffer it should be like this, kind of just these small little adjustments. She does not follow that line of thinking when it comes to changes in physics, just to try and keep the current model. She posits the idea that we need to have some radical changes in our current cosmological model to better fit everything that we're observing, and not just try and save the model we currently have. And you may have seen my rants otherwise. But, yeah. So just remember, this is what Hugh Nibley is attacking, is the application of the slow progress of evolution culturally and civilization-wise that was brought up because of the let's apply evolution to everything, which even evolution itself can't actually follow. I'm sorry, it can't. Both the origin of life doesn't really have explanation, the Cambrian explosion, and a couple of other points. It's a very elegant and very useful theory, and you don't throw the whole thing out, but you should understand its own limitations. That's it. That's all I'm saying. And so, he was saying, in an age when iron and steel were supposedly undreamt of, today the protest must be rather feeble, even in those quarters still under the influence of a theory of evolutionism, which has been dragged so unfortunately into the study of ancient history. That was a quote. Nothing better illustrates the hopelessness of trying to apply this neat, convenient, mechanical rule of progress to history than the present-day status of the Metal Ages. Let me refer you to Wainwright's recent study on the coming of iron. There you will learn that the use of iron is as primitive as that of any other metal, in using scraps of meteoric iron, whilst, and I'm sorry, he's brought up meteoric iron a couple of times. Either meteoric iron was around a lot more than what we knew, or I just, even today, when meteors hit the Earth, scientists basically look for them in Antarctica. Why? Just because it's a lot easier to find them there. There's no forests or grasslands. If there's some sort of shown impact, man, that's excellent. Antarctica kind of helps really make it a lot easier to find. Because you just going around in some forest and suddenly you trip over a rock, the chances of it being a meteorite are basically nil, constantly and all the time. And so, anyways, in using scraps of meteoric iron, while still in the Chalcolithic age. Yeah, Chalcolithic. I wish I were more of a ancient historian, because I would know what this age is. I don't. And that's the other problem, you see? This kind of stuff with specificity is not taught broadly anymore. And so they were using meteoric iron in extremely primitive times, is what it sounds like. The Eskimos did so, though otherwise only in the Bronze Age, as did the Neolithic Indians of Ohio. Cough, cough. Sorry, I lean to believing more in the heartland for the Book of Mormon these days, so whether Neolithic means that it was during the Book of Mormon times or not, probably not. Again, might be earlier than them. The Sumerians of Ur were at times in the early Bronze Age, though later they relapsed into the Copper Age. Sorry, there's a footnote. Oh, he's still pointing to the book that he mentioned. The possibility of a relapse is very significant. See? It's about the stability of the society. There is no reason why other nations cannot go backwards, as well as the Sumerians. But scraps of meteoric iron were not the only prehistoric source, for it now transpires that though not interested in it, man was able at an extremely early date to smelt his own iron from ores and manufacture it into weapons. But how can any men have made such a great discovery or perpetuated such a difficult art without being interested in it? For a modern example, on YouTube there is a channel called Primitive Technology. It's by this guy who I figured out was in Australia, probably the northeastern coast area, because that has more kind of rainforesty areas. For years on his channel, he's been building up all sorts of different things. His main thrust, time after time, little bit, has been to figure out how to smelt iron. And he uses this bacteria that accumulates iron in the bacteria to then dry them out and smelt them. And he's gotten little tiny pellets of iron, tiny pellets of iron. And he's gotten maybe like that much iron over several years. It's not easy at all. It's not like, oh, I got this chunk of rock and now I just melt it down. Yeah, really. How do you melt down that rock, big guy? And followed by which, how do you extract the iron from the slag? And followed by which, how do you make sure that it's pure enough? And how do you do that with enough? It's just problem after problem. It becomes crazy. To get good at something like that, it's tough. You need stability. All right. But how can any man have made such a great discovery or perpetuated such a difficult art without being interested in it? We can only believe that there were somewhere people who were interested in it. And such people, as we shall presently see, actually dwelt in the original home of the Jaredites. Certainly there is no longer any reason for denying the Jaredites' iron if they wanted it. A Mesopotamian knife blade, not of meteoric origin, and set in a handle, has been dated with certainty to the 28th century BC. Iron from the Great Pyramid goes back 2,900 BC, and might perhaps have been smelted from an ore. Yet the Egyptians, far from specializing in iron, never paid much attention to the stuff except in their primitive rituals. And last place we would expect to find it, if it were a late invention, while Wainwright himself found the iron beads at Girza in Egypt that date to about those iron beads date to about 3,500 or earlier. Actually, Egypt was the last country of the Near East to enter the Iron Age. And then under an intensification of northern influences. In fact, by 1000 BC, Egypt still keeps on in the Bronze Age. Having proved that the working of iron is as old as civilization, the Egyptians then go on to prove that civilization is perfectly free to ignore it, to the dismay of the evolutionists. It was the Asiatics who really made the most of iron. As early as 1925 BC, a Hittite king had a throne of iron, and in Hittite temple inventories, iron is the common metal, not the bronze, to which one is accustomed in other lands of the Near East. I would also mention, when Hugh Nibley talks about civilizations ignoring technologies, take, for example, ancient China. Ancient China had a whole bunch of technologies that were very advanced for its time, but then didn't accept or advance those technologies much over a very long time frame. So there's another really good example. And there are books that have been written on it too. I wish I were more someone who consumed such histories, but that's why I'm trying to work up to it. If we move farther east into the region in which the Jaredites took their rise, we find the manufacture of iron so far advanced by the Amarna period that the local monarch can send to the king of Egypt 2 splendid daggers whose blade is of Kabalkinu, the word being usually translated as steel. Though the translation is not absolutely certain, literary references to steel are very ancient. The Zend Avesta refers constantly to steel, and steel comes before iron in the 4 ages of Zarathustra. Okay, I thought Zarathustra was a literary and musical reference. I did not think of it as an actual person. Maybe I need to look that up a bit more, because there's the 2001 Space Odyssey theme, Thus Saith Zarathustra. Da, 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 boom, 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 boom. So, I got that. And I've seen it in different literary depictions. I didn't think of it as an actual true person. It's kind of like saying Prometheus, right? It's like, oh yeah, I know the concept of Prometheus from the annals of Greek myth, but I didn't know there was an age of Zarathustra. It would be like the age of Prometheus. It struck me as weird, because I've never heard of this before. So, 4 ages of... So, the Zend Avesta refers constantly to steel, which I am assuming is a book or literature, and steel comes before iron. Steel comes before iron in the 4 ages of Zarathustra, reminding one of the Vedic doctrine that the heaven was created out of steel, and that steel was the sky blue metal of the earliest Egyptians and Babylonians. The reference for that is the Zend Avesta book he was talking about. We treat the subject in dealing with Nephi's steel bow above. A little bit above. We already talked about that. The legends of tribes of Asia are full of iron and steel, birds, arrows, and other magic articles, and the founder of the Seljuk dynasty of Iran was, as we have noted, called iron or steel bow. The working of iron is practiced in Central Asia, even by primitive tribes, and Marco Polo, see his book 139, speaks of them as mining steel rather than iron. Really? His travels, number 1, traveling through Central Asia in 568 AD, Menander was often met by primitive tribesmen from the mountain who tried to sell him their native ironware. Menander, okay, yeah. So that's the footnote information that's in there. Where steel may be taken to mean any form of very tough iron, the correct chemical formula for it is found in steel objects from Ras Shamra, dating back to the 14th century BC. If we would trace the stuff back to its place and time of origin, we should, in all probability, find ourselves at home with the Jaredites, for theirs was a land of tubal cane and the far northwest corner of Mesopotamia, which Wainwright observes in approving the account in Genesis 4:22, is the oldest land where we know stories of manufactured iron were kept and distributed in the world. Whew. Far northwest corner of Mesopotamia. So he's thinking probably the Syria area? Syria and Iraq area of Mesopotamia. Yeah, interesting. Makes me wonder, like, okay, so in the primitive technology Chandler was talking about earlier, he was using literally like dried out iron accumulating bacteria to try and make these prills, the little tiny pellets of iron. And he was successful. Obviously, is not getting much from all that. So, why doesn't I'm just curious if it's a lot easier to work iron from ore, and well, how do you find the right ore, right? Especially if you're in Australia in a forest. So I wonder if it has to be in a mountainous area. Because if you look at the steppes up there, there's just tons of different foothills and geological folds. I wonder where iron accumulates. You know, I get the idea that gold is often associated with quartz seams, and you find it in rivers where there's young mountains that are just pushed up and uplifted, that kind of stuff. So I wonder if iron has a certain way of accumulating in specific spots, or just as long as you know the right color of the rocks to look for, try those. Can you, now I'm really curious, can you reclaim iron from rust? The reason I ask is, let's say you come to an exposed rock face that has the reddish tin of rusted iron. And so you're like, great, I'll crush up these rocks, smelt them, etc. Can you take that rust, which is oxidized iron, and add it to the mix and melt it down and have it be iron again? I'm a physicist, not a metallurgist, if you couldn't tell. Anyways, so we were talking about the northwest region of Mesopotamia. It is in this region and not to Egypt that we must look for the earliest as well as the best types of ancient ironwork, even though the Egyptian knew iron by 3500 BC at least. The example of iron, steel, and bronze is instructive. They're not evolved by imperceptible degrees to conquer the world in steady progressive triumph through the ages, but appear fully developed to be used in one place and forbidden in another, thrive in one age and to be given up in the next. The same applies to another product attributed to the Jaredites and believed until recent years to have been a relatively late invention. I would say cement is another one, or glass. Anyways, in Joseph Smith's day, itchy nose. In Joseph Smith's day, and long after there was not a scholar who did not accept Plini's account of the origin of glass without question, I used to be perplexed by this fact that in reference to Ether 233, to windows that will be dashed in pieces can only refer to glass windows, since no other kind would be waterproof and still be windows, and they would have to be brittle to be dashed in pieces. Moreover, well, I don't know, you have the paper windows of Japan. Well, let's keep reading. And maybe the wood of the window. Anyways, moreover, it makes more sense for it to be glass, though. Moreover, Moroni, in actual referencing to transparent glass in Ether 3.1, is probably following ether. This would make the invention of glass far older than anyone dreamed it was until the recent findings of such objects as Egyptian glass beads from the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Ooh, oh. He's talking about the molten stones of the glass stones that the brother of Jared made for the Lord to touch. Anyways, so Ether 3.1, transparent glass is probably following ether, 3rd millennium BC, and plaques of turquoise blue glass of excellent quality in the possession of Zir, one of the very earliest queens of Egypt. Very little is known, writes Newberry, about the early history of glass, though that history can indeed be traced back to prehistoric times, for glass beads have been found in prehistoric graves. We need not be surprised if the occurrences of glass objects before the 16th century BC are few and far between, for glass rots like wood. I did not know that. I always assumed that glass was constant, but if you think about it, it's an amorphous solid. The old myth that glass is still viscous and is, slowly, dribbles down over time from old windows is false. All it is that the glass that they made was uneven, and for stability reasons, they stuck the wider part of the glass for which they cut the windows at the bottom. It's not that it oozed down there over the centuries. That is incorrect. It is an amorphous solid, and it is solid. So, sorry to burst that little myth if you've ever had that before. But I think there's a Wikipedia article about misconceptions that has a whole bunch of crazy ones. But that's definitely on there. Anyways, it's just I can see it being worn away because it is an amorphous solid. It was made from silica, which I think of as sand. Again, I'm not a metallurgist, so I have this very cute kiddie idea of how this all works. And it's like, pat me on the head and say I'm cute. But to me, the idea would be, why would glass rot? I wonder if it has to do with the quality of glass, too. Because if it's an ancient glass, then I could see it being broken and worn away and just dusted over time as it slowly falls apart. But I never thought of it rotting like wood. That's interesting. We need not be surprised for glass rots like wood. And it is a wonder that any, if not all, survives from remote antiquity. There is all the difference in the world, moreover, between few glass objects to none at all. One clot of ruddy dirt is all we have to show that the Mesopotamians were using iron knives, but at the very beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. But that is all we need. Likewise, from the earliest and dated piece of glass known, and he emphasized dated, comes from the time of Amenhotep I. Yet under his immaculate successors, glass vases appear that indicate an advanced technique in glass working. They reveal their art in a high state of proficiency. That must be an outcome of a long series of experiments, writes Newberry, which again is an excellent point. The finding of the oldest glass and ironwork in Egypt is not a tribute to superior civilization of the Egyptians at all, but rather to the superior preservative qualities of their dry sands. We have seen that Egyptians cared very little for iron, which was really at home in the land of Tubal-Cain. For the same would be true of glass, the myths and folklore of the oldest stratum of Asiatic legend, the Swan Maiden and arrow chain cycles, for example. What? What is this really cool old mythological stuff? Who is the Swan? I mean, the Swan Maiden that I know is the Princess and the Swan or whatever, and the arrow chain cycles, I'd love to know what these are full of glass mountains, glass places, and glass windows. Because if you break glass, you just keep breaking it down. I mean, no wonder it doesn't survive. A glass pane from back then? Look at what humans do to buildings in Detroit that have been abandoned for just a year. You think glass is going to survive from that house? Really? In one extremely archaic, widespread legend, the Shamir bird, it goes by many names, seeking to enter the chamber of the queen of the underworld, breaks his wings on the glass pane of her window when he tries to fly through it. The glass mountain of the northern legend, and the glass place of the immense Sheba cycle, have I shown in another study to be variants of this. Glaze and vitreous paste, so close to glass that its absence in the same region comes as a surprise. Glaze and vitreous paste, so close to glass that its absence in the same region comes as a surprise, were known and widely used in Egypt and Mesopotamia from the 4th millennium BC onwards. Holy crap, so glass is a lot older, and so is iron. I'm learning so much. But such stuff applied to clay objects has a far better chance of leaving a trace of itself than does pure glass, which simply disintegrates in damp soil. Really? I didn't know that. A process which I have often had opportunity to observe in ancient Greek trash heaps. This easily accounts for the scarcity of glass remains outside of Egypt. We now realize that the scholars who categorically deny Marco Polo's claim to have seen colored glass windows at the court of Grand Khan spoke too soon. This is what I'm talking about. How many times do we have people give true eyewitnesses in the accounts of what they draw, show, journal, and then we're like, oh, no, we know better than them. Oh, they don't know what they're talking about. It's just ridiculous. Why don't these people actually believe? Okay, I understand that sometimes if you have people who sit there and if you've ever encountered people who are liars because they're out there and they just keep going and embellishing and telling all this improbable stuff, I understand why sometimes people don't believe them, but if there is a person who has a propensity for honesty and accuracy, and you just discount it because you believe they're a liar, it sucks. It's a double bind. I get it. I don't like it. I'd like to sit here and go, wah, and be all animated about why don't we listen to these people? But at the same time, it's like, dude, you were just watching a video the other day about someone who was talking about this trauma train of stuff, but everything pointed to the fact that these people were an embellisher, that they were lying, and it showed because they were filling in their trauma with stuff that they came back and found, not that they remembered themselves originally. And it happened again and again and again in a very extremely improbable chain of everyone is against me kind of conspiracy. Yeah, so I get it. When you look at a story that seems extremely incredible, and you're used to being with people who are liars and braggarts, or you've at least come across one or two in your life, it makes you a little more cautious. So I can understand the skepticism. And I would really understand the skepticism if that's the life that you lead and live in and you're projecting on other people. Oh, history's messy. But sorry, you can tell that sometimes I'm like, why? It boggles my mind when sometimes we just ignore certain witnesses. In preference for our own narratives, like that evolutionary narrative, applied to civilization, which can't work. It doesn't show properly. And Hugh Nibley is making extremely good points about that. Anyway, let me continue. But such stuff applied to clay objects scarcely remains. He's observed it in Greek trash heaps. We spoke too soon because the Grand Khan had colored glass. A contemporary of Marco mentions that the windows of some of the yachts or barges had plate glass in China, but the commenter who cites this authority adds that the manufacturer was probably European. It is interesting that the earliest use of window glass is interesting that the earliest Sorry, let me reread that. It is interesting that the earliest use of window glass in the Far East was for ship windows, but the fact that glass was scarce in China does not make this European glass, for it was not Europe but Central Asia that excelled in glass production. A Chinese observer in Central Asia in 1221 was impressed by the great native industry, which produced, among other things, windows of clear glass. We have noted that the great Khans had special interest in goldsmiths and glass workers. If glass and iron perish, what shall we say of silk? The fine twined linen of the Jaredites in chapter 10, verse 24, offers no serious problem since, as I pointed out in earlier letters, scraps of the finest linen have actually survived at prehistoric sites in the Old World. But the same verse speaks of silk. Since few substances suffer more complete oxidation than silk, it is not surprising that the only evidence we have of its early existence is written records. But these are sufficient to allow the Jaredites the luxury of their silken garments, if any evidence is to be placed in the claims cited in the Encyclopedia Britannica that silk was worn in China in the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, and in India as early as 4000 BC. The priority of India over China suggests a central distribution point for both of them, which would of course be Central Asia. And indeed, Khotan in Central Asia was the great center of the Middle Ages. Khotan. Now I need to look up where Khotan is. The making of silk on Greek islands at a very early date, and a legend of Minoan Daedalus reported by Apollodorus, which can only refer to silk culture, strongly indicate Asia rather than China as the prehistoric distribution center of knowledge of silk in the world. Remember, Asia commonly referred to kind of the central middle part of the continent, places like Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, western part of India, maybe Pakistan, that Asia area. Like the Oriental Express, the Orient and Asia was the Middle East. Now what we think of as Asia, like China, Japan, the Far East, well, there's a reason they called it the Far East. So when he keeps talking about it definitely being Asia rather than China, that's what he's saying. So keep that in mind. The animal kingdom. Yes, let's cruise through this so that way we can finish the chapter. Like metal and glass, the animals of old have long been misrepresented by the settled preconceptions of the antiquarians. Up until 5 years ago, and perhaps still, the very best archaeologists were convinced that the camel was not known in Egypt until Greek and Roman times, and dismissed the biblical account of Abraham's camels, see Genesis chapter 12, verse 16, as the crudest of blunders. Oh, ho, ho, ho! Again. Oh, ho, 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 we know better. Yet, J.P. Free has been able to demonstrate the continued existence and use of the animal in Egypt right down from prehistoric times to the present, and that on the basis of evidence within reach of any conscientious student. We know that the horse, like the iron, with which it is so often associated in conventional history, did not appear on the scene in just one place to spread gradually and steadily throughout the world, but was repeatedly introduced into the primitive Indo-Germanic culture area, fitting in, so to speak, again and again, while certain prehistoric peoples, e.g. the Anu, and had the ox and the horse before either the dog or the goat or others, like the Etabolean had the dog long before the others. It is rather remarkable, writes McGovern, that we find no specific references to the camel among the Scythians and the Samaritans, although its existence and usefulness must have been known. The moral is that we can never be too sure. Take the dirt ponies of America, thank you very much. Sorry. What about the horses in America? Well, they just found a whole bunch of dirt ponies from before Columbus's time. Ta-da! You can, the Smithsonian, look it up on the internet. Anyways. Sorry, existence. The moral is we can never be too sure. Any naturalist would assume that the elephant has been extinct in Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. For all the evidence the creature has left of itself, it is from written history alone that we receive the assurances that large herds of elephants roamed the temperate lands of Syria and the upper Euphrates as late as the 18th Egyptian dynasty, when the pharaohs hunted them there for sport, and that the elephants were used by the warlords of Central Asia well into the Middle Ages. In late antiquity, the wild variety disappeared without a trace, due perhaps to a change in world climate, or it can be hunting habits and cultural things too. Think of the European lion. They had lions. They ain't there now. Why? Because they killed them all. They were a problem because they ate people at times. Anyway, I think it quite significant that the Book of Mormon associates elephants only with the Jaredites, since there is no apparent reason why they should not have been as common in the 15th century BC. All we know is that they became extinct in large parts of Asia, somewhere between those dates, as they did likewise in the New World to follow the Book of Mormon, leaving only the written records of men to testify of their existence. They have plenty of iron, Acerarum and Andanicum, says Marco Polo of the people of Cobian. Here they make mirrors of highly polished steel, of large size and very handsome. The thing to note here is not primarily the advanced state of steelworking in Central Asia, though that, as we have seen, is significant, but the fact that no one knows for sure what Acarum and Andanicum are. Marco knew, of course, but since the things didn't exist in Europe, there was no Western word for them, and so all he could do was to call them by their only names. It is just so with curlums and cumums of Ether in 9:19. These animals were known to the Nephites, and so Moroni leaves the words untranslated, or else, though known to the Nephites, they are out of our existence, so that our language has no name to call them by. They were simply breeds of those many other kinds of animals which were useful for the food of man. The history of the breeding of animals which were useful for man is an extremely complex one. To trace even such conspicuous breeds as the Arabian horse, the dromedary, or the ox is still quite impossible. Travelers in Central Asia, both from Europe and the Far East, always comment on the peculiar breeds of animals they find there. Camels with two humps, which are really no more like the Arabian camels than llamas are like sheep, big-tailed sheep, and strange varieties of oxen and horses, for none of which it is possible for the travelers to find words in their own languages. So they call dromedaries and back-trained camels both camels and kulons, horses. Just as no doubt the Book of Mormon designates as sheep and cattle breeds that we would hardly recognize. I find it most reassuring that the Book of Ether, taking us to archaic times, insists on complicating things by telling us about animals plainly extinct in the Nephite days and breeds that we cannot identify. The description of it, and actually now it's got me thinking. So he's taking solace in the fact that it makes sense that curlums and cumums were there and we have no real clue of what they are, because that's kind of how it really is. And so that also shows truth in the Book of Mormon because of it. But something made me think about what we rely on fossil evidence to show that something existed in the past. And so often, like these other scientists realize, like, there's no such thing, no horses in America before Columbus, until we find the fossils and show that there was. It makes me wonder then, of domesticated animals, how often do domesticated animals get fossilized? Because, think about it. You might find remains in junk piles, but if it's in a junk pile, would that get fossilized? Because it takes certain conditions for the fossils to form that may not be common. And so the idea of animals just suddenly showing up or dying out makes perfect sense to me. Because think of how we devastated the wolf population as America spread west. There was tons of wolves around. We wiped them. They were a problem to us. We took them out. Just like the Europeans took out lions. We take out the things that are problem animals to us. So, at the same time, it's like, again, I wish I were more of an anthropologist and historian, so I could sit there and say, yeah, well, what about these animals here and those animals there, and there's this evidence of these domesticated animals because we have this. But how would you prove that for ancient ones where they say they have it, but then you're like, oh, they're all liars? Really? Anyway, the description of how people were driven out of the land by a plague of serpents that then hedge up the way that the people could not pass may put a strain on your scientific credulity. I hasten to relieve it. Pompey the Great, we are told, could not get his army into Hyrcania because the way was barred by snakes along the Araxes, a stream that still swarms with the creatures. Really? One of the chief philanthropic activities of the Persian Magi was to make war on the snakes, a duty which must go back to a time when the race was sorely pressed by them. And see Ireland. See good old St. Patrick taking out the snakes there, right? The Absartitani were said to have been driven from their country by snakes. Hyginus, number 26, that's the book he's getting that from. And Esarhaddon of Assyria recalls the horror and danger of a march by his army through a land of serpents and scorpions with which the plain was covered as with ants. In the 13th century AD, Shah Sadruddin set his heart on the building of a capital which should surpass all other cities in splendor, yet the project had to be abandoned after enormous expense during a period of drought to place the place so swarmed with serpents that no one could live in it. So,
I got a reliner for your trash can.
Oh, why, thank you. So good to see you, my cute little kitten. I gotta finish this so I can take you guys to school, so let me finish this up. It is interesting in this connection that the plague of serpents in Ether is described as following upon a period of extreme drought. See chapter 9, verse 30. In the 10th chapter of Ether, we read how great hunting expeditions were undertaken in the days of King Lib to the rich game country of the south to hunt food for the people of the land. Chapter 10:19. Westerners are prone to think of hunting as a very individualistic activity. Indeed, Oppenheimer insists that hunters operate always either in small groups or alone. But that is not the way of ancient Asiatics hunted. According to the Ordic and William, the Mongols always hunted in a great battues, thousands of soldiers driving the game toward the center of a great ring where the king and his court could take their pick of the animals. That was the normal way of provisioning an army and a nation in Asia, as Xenophon describes in 17 centuries before Carpini. Thousands of years before Xenophon, a pre-dynastic Egyptian carved a green slate palette on which he depicted an army of beaters forming a great ring around a panicked confusion of animals being driven towards a round enclosure in the center. It is the royal hunt, Jaredite fashion, at the dawn of history. See also pictographs of hunting mammoths. You have a whole bunch of people driving it and a few people throwing spears, or a bunch of people throwing spears. In these great hunts, the king was always the leader, as among the Jaredites, and Lib also himself became a great hunter. Chapter 9, verse 19, or sorry, chapter 10, verse 19. Kings must be hunters, and every royal court must have its hunting preserve in imitation of the early rulers of Asia, who invariably set aside vast tracts of land as animal refuges where habitation was forbidden. Oh, they were smart about that then. Here the Book of Mormon confronts us with a truly astounding scoop. And they did preserve the land southward for a wilderness to get game. And the whole face of the land northward was covered with inhabitants. Ether 10:21. The picture of the old Asiatic hunting economy is complete in all its essentials and correct on all points. Dang, that is great. Iron, silk, glass, and animals all line up. But it also makes it interesting, because that means remember, the land of desolation was the land of the Jaredites, which was northward, according to the generic references in the Book of Mormon. The land southward is where the Nephites and Lamanites landed and took over, and they took over basically a land that was uninhabited. Now, if you lean towards the Mesoamerican area, you might think of the Northland as something like generally the Mexico and southwestern United States, maybe. And I can understand that, because it's very desolate, and there's a bunch of buildings there that are made with adobe and things like that. And that was my thought originally. But if you believe kind of in the Heartlander area, then the land northward is kind of the Great Lakes area. And so it's kind of interesting, because I don't know, there's just a lot to think about and work on in those regards, but the at least the internal cohesive standard culture between what is presented in the Book of Mormon and what shows in real life culture anciently and passed through generations is still cohesive in there. The question is how can we... there's so much to think about on this, and I don't have a way of describing it properly. So either way, I hope you've enjoyed, and may God be with you.